The NFL Combine is now in the books. Could bad news for a top prospect be good news for the Jets? We'll discuss today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, March 3rd, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangReadNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Well, the NFL Combine is completed. It took place late last week in Indianapolis. Today, we're going to break down some of the key performances and how they could impact the New York Jets. First, I want to start by apologizing. This episode's getting up later than the day than it typically is. When we closed out the show on Friday, I mentioned that I was going skydiving over the weekend. So I was wondering if anybody out there was worried that my parachute did not open, and that's the reason that the show did not go up on time Monday. It was just a confluence of things Monday. My skydiving experience actually had to be canceled for weather, so I'm going to try again in a few weeks. But the NFL Combine did take place in Indianapolis. There's so many different angles you can go to discuss what happened. I mean, pretty much any platform, any podcast, any website's going to have different winners and losers. So I tried to look at things that could have an angle for the New York Jets, particularly what they're going to do with the 7th overall pick. And the first thing I'm going to start with is an injury that was unveiled at the Combine, and that's from Penn State's talented defensive end, Abdul Carter, who was dealing with a shoulder injury, played through a shoulder injury during the college football playoff, and has a stress reaction in his right foot. So he did not take part in any of the drills. And I have to be honest with you, this is probably wishful thinking for me to think that teams would be dumb enough to let Abdul Carter fall to 7. But, sometimes teams overreact to this stuff. Sometimes teams actually are that dumb. There's no reason to believe that Carter is going to be materially impacted in his ability to play. I mean, it'll be fully healed by the time the season starts. But sometimes teams get a little weird with this stuff. So I mean, I mentioned Abdul Carter last week during a Combine preview show that I did, and I almost feel bad because I don't want to root against the kid, but if there's anything that makes him fall, it's good for the Jets because he'd be a great fit for the Jets. I think he's a perfect fit for what Aaron Glenn wants in the defense. He's got experience playing off-ball linebacker, but he's also developed into a really good pass rusher, and he's a guy who at times is unblockable as a pass rusher, despite the fact that he's still kind of learning how to play that position, despite the fact he's still developing moves. And in that college football playoff, if you watched him play against Notre Dame, he was playing with a shoulder injury. He was playing through an injury, and he was still the best player on the field. He was completely dominant. And Aaron Glenn's defense, I think he could fit a couple different spots. I think, he might just say, let's not get fancy here. He's a great pass rusher, just have him rush the passer. But he has experience at off-ball linebacker. Aaron Glenn likes to blitz a lot. He likes to bring his line. And when Aaron Glenn blitzes, he usually brings linebackers. He's not bringing safeties. He's not bringing corners all that much. He's blitzing linebackers. So would you want to have him play a little traditional linebacker and then kind of on passing downs have him blitz? I don't know. That's the direction I'd go in. But it's could conceivably be a possibility. Aaron Glenn kind of likes his linebackers to be Swiss Army knives, to do a little bit of everything. You have lots of different ways you could fit. And I know that some people will say, well, the Jets have Jermaine Johnson and the Jets have Will McDonald. And look, Will McDonald had a good season this year. There's no question about that. But I do think, and we'll see, the new coaching staff may have McDonald do things a little differently. They may have him put more bulk on, like the Jets were talking about doing with him a year ago. So he comes into camp a little bit bigger. McDonald struggles playing against the run, though. The other thing I'm going to say, and I think this is where the initial analysis of the Will McDonald pick 2 years ago kind of missed. Because when the Jets picked Will McDonald in the first round 2 years ago, it was met with an enormous backlash, an overwhelming backlash. And yours truly was one of the few people that actually kind of encouraged people to keep an open mind on that, because there are certain positions in the NFL I truly believe you can never have enough talent. These are the premium positions on the field. And, I would talk quarterback. You could talk offensive line. You could talk wide receiver. I think defensive end's another one of those positions, because a great defensive end changes the game. And if you can have waves and waves of talent on your defensive line and keep everybody fresh, I think it's a real benefit for you. Now, is it realistic to expect Abdul Carter to fall to 7? Well, I don't think the combine was that important to him for him. I mean, I guess if he did poorly, maybe people would kind of raise an eyebrow. But he's a guy who you just watch him on the field, he knows how to play. And there are certain guys. Again, sometimes teams overthink this stuff, but I don't know that the combine was all that important. He'll probably go to his pro day, and the pro day is going to be very friendly confines. There are all these rumors across the scouting community that certain teams like have their 40-yard dash course with a downhill slope. And there are all sorts of cheat tricks you hear about. Players typically do perform better at the pro days, which take place on their campus. And again, they're kind of given favorable situations there. He'll probably go out there and do really well at his pro day. His injury should be, it sounds like he's going to go by then. And there are already people floating rumors that he could run a 4.340, which would be absolutely unbelievable at his size. Now, how important is that? I don't really know. In fact, I think the combine is actually going to be less important as we go forward, because player tracking data has become so much more improved in recent years. And you can judge how quickly a guy plays and how well he cuts by just using player tracking data at this point. The combine will always exist because it's become such an entity in the NFL. But I think its importance for teams is going to go downhill a bit. The other thing with Abdul Carter is he's got a very aggressive agent in Drew Rosenhaus, who you guys kind of like come back on the radar. I hadn't heard Drew Rosenhaus' name in a really long time. And then Hassan Reddick hired him during the season, and he negotiated the contract with Woody Johnson to get Reddick back to the Jets, which obviously did not work out very well for the Jets. But go back 25 years, Drew Rosenhaus was maybe the most prominent agent in the NFL. I mean, he was like kind of the stereotype of like everything bad you hear about the NFL agent, because he was so aggressive and so kind of arrogance. The last thing I remember about Drew Rosenhaus was he was part of a Terrell Owens holdout. Terrell Owens signed with the Eagles in 2004, got a big contract, and then 1 year later was demanding an even bigger contract. Rosenhaus was part of the famous scene where Owens held a press conference in his driveway doing sit-ups. So Drew Rosenhaus is back in the mix, and Drew Rosenhaus is very aggressive pushing his clients. And I do think sometimes teams bend to the will of aggressive agents a little bit. I mean, Rosenhaus, you go back to 2003, there's a player, Willis McGahee, who was viewed as a first-round pick and tore his ACL in the national championship game. And Rosenhaus did like a media tour and got McGahee drafted in the first round, even coming off a torn ACL. So with that said, I mean, I don't know how realistic it is for Abdul Carter to fall to 7. I don't know it's realistic that this particular injury, which, again, doesn't sound like a big deal. Sounds like he should be ready for mini camp. Would it impact him? No, but again, wishful thinking on my part. Maybe if enough things add up. And again, like I feel bad. Like I don't want to be a bad person who's rooting against the kid, but Carter's just so talented, and he's just such a good fit for what the Jets would want in a player, and he could fill multiple roles for this team. That I don't know. I find myself like hoping against hope that maybe things start to minor things start to make teams do something silly and pass on such a talented player. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to turn our attention to a player who I think has potential, a player I think has ability, and a player who actually fits a big need for the Jets, but not a player that I'm all that interested in seeing the Jets draft. Well, he had a big combine. I'll tell you who that player is and what it could mean for the Jets as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because with FanDuel, you can place live bets through the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a big fourth quarter comeback, you could stay in on the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you could even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. You will love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether you're backing your team for a late-game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch 3, you'll never feel like you missed your chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. And right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the National Basketball Association. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. We're talking about the NFL Scouting Combine today. It took place late last week and into the weekend in Indianapolis. There's so many different angles you can go to, so I'm trying to find like angles that really tie into the Jets, particularly the 7th pick. And I don't know why this is the case, but like everywhere you go, people are talking about one quarterback's performance that stood out, and that was Jaxson Dart out of Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi. And I'm sitting here asking, what exactly did he do? I mean, he threw balls and he threw passes and drills. But it happens in the NFL combine that people go crazy when they see a quarterback throw in shorts. And I do think that there are instances where the combine can be a useful tool. Again, going back to what I said in the first segment, I think that its utility is going to go downhill now that we're going to start to get a better grasp of how fast players are in game situations, because you always hear about guys, he plays faster than he's timed or he plays slower than he's timed. And that's true because the drills you do in the NFL scouting combine, they don't, there's some overlap to what you do in an NFL or college game, but it's not a complete overlap. There are certain things that you just that it doesn't really tell you. And there are certain situations that overlap. If a guy runs a 4.3 40 at the wide receiver position, that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be a number one receiver. That's a misnomer you hear a lot at the combine. But if he runs a 4.3 40, he's not slow. And that was I remember when Garrett Wilson ran a 4.3 40 3 years ago. Did that mean Garrett Wilson was going to be a great deep threat? No, but it meant, the one question you maybe had about Garrett was how fast is he? That showed you he's plenty fast. He's going to be fine in the NFL. So there are spots where the combine can be useful. I don't know what you're getting watching a quarterback throw the ball in shorts. You have film of actual games of him participating against defenses at game speed where there are actually guys who can hit him. Isn't that more instructive than watching the guy throw the ball in shorts? I don't get it. But Dart apparently impressed a lot of people throwing the ball in shorts in these drills. Maybe he was throwing routes he doesn't see in college or something like that. Maybe he was throwing with the anticipation. And this could be a big thing for the Jets because it's pretty clear right now the top two quarterbacks rated almost unanimously are Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward. A lot of people have Ward ahead of Sanders. A few people have Sanders ahead of Ward. The number 3 quarterback spot, kind of up in the air. Some people say Jalen Milroe, but Dart's a guy who, could rise through the process. Now, is he expected to go as high as 7 right now? Well, not really. But we know at the quarterback position, sometimes teams are desperate to find their guy. Sometimes teams have a way of talking themselves into a certain player. And that could happen with Dart. And I think, it's very easy to talk yourself into a quarterback because you're a coach, finding a good quarterback in the draft is a career maker. Your GM, it's the same thing. It's a career maker if you find a good quarterback in the draft. And you look at what happened with other teams last year. You look at the impact Jalen Daniels had in Washington. You look at the impact Bo Nix had. And Bo Nix was an interesting one because he was not viewed as a lot of people were questioning, would he fall to day 2? Could he be a late day 2 pick? People didn't really know. There was not a lot of consensus about where Bo Nix was going to go. And Broncos ended up surprising a lot of people by drafting him in the first round. He ended up having a pretty good rookie season, and the Broncos went to the playoffs. Broncos ended what was the second longest playoff drought in the league. The only team with a longer playoff drought heading into the season was the Jets. So some team, some coach, some team, some GM might look at Jaxson Dart and say, well, you know what, this could be our guy. Now, could that team be the Jets? Conceivably, but I got to be honest with you. I don't think I would want Jaxson Dart in the top 10. I think there's a spot for him, but when I watch him, I do see NFL level attributes. I think the arm is good enough for the NFL. Arm's more than good enough for the NFL. It's a good. He's got a good arm. I see him at times do NFL level things. At times I see him throw with anticipation, but I think he's a bit of a project. I think the Ole Miss offense, which was run by their head coach Lane Kiffin, is very well designed. I think it makes life very easy on a quarterback. I don't think a quarterback needs to make a ton of NFL style progression reads in that offense because they scheme guys open pretty easily. I don't think Jaxson Dart had to throw with anticipation a lot. In the NFL, sometimes you have to throw the ball before a guy's open. Sometimes you just have to read the leverage of your receiver and the defender and know the matchup, know your receiver's faster than the defender, and throw the ball before the receiver's open. And by the time the ball gets there, the receiver is open. Jaxson Dart could kind of wait for his receivers to get open in college. And look, I do think that there's a spot where he'd make sense for the Jets. I think if we got into the day 2 range, he might be a worthy guy to take a shot on. I would not really be that interested in seeing the Jets draft him at 7. And a lot of this comes down to what do Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji think? Because Glenn and Muji come from 2 different organizations. Muji comes from those Broncos where he saw the difference a quarterback can make. But Glenn came from Detroit. And Detroit, under Aaron Glenn, I know he wasn't running the whole team, but in the time Aaron Glenn was there, Aaron Glenn saw a team that got a new coaching staff in 2021 and the new front office, and their first move was to trade the franchise quarterback Matthew Stafford, and they built things around a guy who's a quality quarterback in Jared Goff, but one who's rather limited. And they're, Detroit, I think at some point Detroit's probably going to take a shot in the draft at a guy they think has big upside that can maybe lifts their ceiling higher than Goff provides. But Detroit's been patient at the quarterback position, a lot more patient than people thought. A lot of people didn't think Goff would last 4 years in Detroit and still be going, and he is. So, what direction are the Jets going to go? It's tough to say. And, even just because Muji came from Denver doesn't necessarily mean the Jets are going to be interested in drafting Dart. It doesn't necessarily mean the Jets are going to be interested at all in taking a quarterback this year. Although the Denver situation, there are a lot of parallels with the Jets, because last year the Broncos got rid of Russell Wilson and everybody said, well, they're heading to a rebuilding year, and they made a pick and got somebody. But I think the big area here is that the Jets could really use a trade down. And Jets have traded a lot of draft capital away the last couple of years. They found themselves short on draft picks. One of the things that frustrated me, because they improved the team over the previous years before in 2021, 2022, they improved the roster quite a bit. That's because they invested in draft picks. They made sure they got extra draft picks. They built their stock of draft picks. And then 2023 comes and Aaron Rodgers comes and we start doing the opposite things. We don't get the results. And the Jets have been short on draft picks the last couple of years. The Jets have more draft picks going out the door this year. Third round picks going to the Raiders for Devontae Adams. Next year, the third round picks going to Philadelphia for Hassan Reddick. The Jets did recoup a third round pick this year in a trade they made in the 2024 draft with Detroit, got an extra third rounder. But the Jets could use more picks. And if a quarterback really rises up the board, and I know this is going to be controversial because a lot of people will just want the Jets to take a quarterback, because people will say, well, how can the Jets trade a pick with a quarterback when they need a quarterback? Well, you know what? The team may not be quite ready for a quarterback, and the right quarterback may not be there. There might not be a quarterback you want to draft at 7. If that's the case, what happens in the NFL frequently, there's another team that's kind of desperate, another, coaching staff trying to save its job. Sometimes they make deals, and they get desperate and they overpay. And typically when a team's trading up for a quarterback in the top 10, they're overpaying the traditional price. They're paying more. You usually pay a premium to move up for a quarterback. And I think the Jets really need to focus on recouping the draft capital. So when I see a quarterback like Jaxson Dart potentially raise his stock, and I'm not sure he's quite to 7 yet, but when I see a quarterback like Jaxson Dart raise his stock, I think it's a promising thing for the Jets, not because he's necessarily a player the Jets would want to draft where they're picking, but because perhaps, some team gets interested. Some team's willing to move up. Something worth watching. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, there are some other performances of note at the Combine. We could talk about the offensive line. We talk about the linebacker position. We'll talk about some other things that Jets fans might want to keep their eye on as we continue here on this Monday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. We're breaking down what happened at the NFL Scouting Combine over the weekend. I wanted to circle back on a couple of the guys I spoke about last week in the Combine preview show, players to watch. Of course, the guy I talked about the most didn't participate in the drills. So that's Ted McMillan, the receiver out of Arizona. And I think for me, and maybe not for other teams because he is kind of viewed as the consensus number one receiver, but I do have some questions about his speed. And look, he's not a blazer. He's more of he's been compared with a Drake London kind of guy where he wins. He's a big receiver. But I want to know how fast he is, because I do think that there's a certain level of speed you have to have in the NFL. Now he may have thought that, it's just too risky. I'll run to my pro day at Arizona, where again, things tend to be set up in a very favorable way for the prospects because, the schools want their prospects to succeed. So Ted McMillan did not participate in the on-field drills. There was talk that he met with the Jets at the Combine. So, I think he's a guy that remains very viable as an option at pick number 7. Wide receiver is another one of those positions where you can't have enough good players. And right now the Jets have one good player at the receiver position. That's Garrett Wilson. That's, we're assuming, Devontae Adams gets cut at some point in the days and weeks ahead. But Ted McMillan does not participate in drills at the Combine. This is good because I do think there's a question to an extent about his athleticism, even though it's not going to be his bread and butter in the NFL. for me, that's a little knock against him, and we'll see how things go forward during his pro day, where things will be set up very favorably for him. But I would have liked to have gotten a little clarity on him. There were a couple guys who really did have standout performances. Another guy I mentioned, there were a couple guys named Campbell. First is Jihad Campbell, the linebacker out of Alabama, ran a 4.5240. And his 10-yard split was 1.6, and his 20-yard split was 2.84. So those are all really, really good for a guy at the linebacker position. And again, like, I'm not sure, I said this last week, I'm not sure he's on the table at 7, but if you get into a scenario where you're trading back a little bit, or maybe you get into a scenario where you're trading up from your second round pick, I think Jihad Campbell could be an option. I think, he'd be a guy that fits an Aaron Glenn defense quite well at the linebacker position. He's not as dynamic of a pass rusher as Abdul Carter, but Campbell's another guy that actually does have pass rushing experience. And again, Aaron Glenn likes his linebackers to be kind of jack of all trades kind of guys. So Campbell was expected to have a big combine, and he sure did. And he displayed, he displayed the speed that appears when you see him on the film. So that's a potentially interesting candidate for the New York Jets. And then on the offensive line, we haven't talked a lot about offensive line prospects just yet, and there's good reason for that. Jets just drafted a tackle last year in Olufashinu. Would they draft another tackle? Well, again, thinking about the way the leadership of the Jets have built their teams, the Detroit Lions did draft Penn Sewell to play right tackle for them. Back, if you go back to 2021, and in today's NFL, I firmly believe right tackle is now a premium position in this league. For a really long time, left tackle was the key spot. And this goes back to the 80s. There was a point in the NFL, I'm going to give you a little history lesson here. Hopefully it's entertaining. There was a point in the NFL where, like, the 5 linemen were kind of viewed as interchangeable. It's like you didn't really, the same attributes were pretty much needed across the board. There wasn't really a big difference between your center and your right tackle, or your left guard and your left tackle. You're just looking for guys who could block. In the 80s, Lawrence Taylor emerged as the dominant pass rusher for the New York Giants. And teams really started focusing. San Francisco 49ers were one. They focused on getting a left tackle. See, that's where Lawrence Taylor lined up. Lawrence Taylor lined up over the left tackle. So left tackle started to become a premium position in the 80s, whereas in the past, it had just kind of been interchangeable with any of the other offensive line spots. And through the 80s and the 90s, left tackle continued to rise in prominence. Well, you get to the 2000s, defenses figure this out. So defenses start lining up their best pass rushers against the right tackle, because the right tackle tends to be the weaker player. We get to the 2010s, offenses start to figure this out. And they say, we need to get a good player at the right tackle position. So now these days, I think both tackle spots are premium positions. So, even though, you draft a tackle, and that either means that he's going to right tackle, or you're less likely you're moving Olufashinu to right tackle. It's not, I don't think it would be a bad move. I like the idea of investing in the offensive line. I mean, I think that there were many ways where Joe Douglas did not execute at a high level. And I think there were many ways philosophically that he, wasn't really using NFL best practices. But one thing I did appreciate was he always tried to focus on the offensive line. And I think that was the right philosophy. I think it was a much better philosophy than Mike Maccagnan. Unfortunately, for the most part, up until his last year, where, unfortunately for Douglas, like, he finally gets it right and he gets fired. He didn't do that well. But I think the concept of really investing in the trenches is sound, because that's what Detroit did. And Will Campbell, who's viewed as one of the best, probably the best tackle prospect, a guy who may very well may not make it to 7, but he did well. He had a sub 5 40-yard dash, and believe it or not, there actually is some correlation. It's been shown between offensive linemen's 40-yard dashes and having success in the league. Campbell also, though, did well in the broad jump. He actually did better than, he actually had the best broad jump of any offensive lineman. And that can be an important measure for a tackle, because tackles have to defend the edge, and to defend the edge, you got to explode. You got to go against the defensive end or a linebacker who's lined up out wide. You got to cover a lot of ground and play. You got to explode off the ball, get all the way outside. So out of LSU, again, it's Will Campbell. He had a very good combine and cemented his status as, probably the number one tackle off the board. And maybe he goes before the Jets pick, but if he's on the board when the Jets pick, I think he could be somebody worth keeping an eye on. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show or listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.